Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilled life possible. I've been talking a lot about art on the show in recent weeks. I had Luke Travers on the show recently to talk about painting and its relation to flourishing, how we can get more out of paintings, an artwork, or rather an art form that not many of us turn to very often for any sort of spiritual fuel. We tend to think of paintings as, when we go to a museum, it's a history exhibit, and we're there to learn about, the artist and the type of brushstrokes or something like that. And we learned about Luke's very different take on painting and flourishing, how we can suspend disbelief to put ourselves into the world of the painting and ask ourselves some key questions that will help us do that, to really enjoy the painting much more. I also spoke with Andrew Bernstein about literature and flourishing, and I think this connection's a bit more obvious because most of us still immerse ourselves, if not in literature, then at the very least in shows and movies on a regular basis, which of course are based on stories which exemplify many of the same values that we can get from good literature, or at least the better artworks do. And it's no accident that I've been focusing a lot lately on art. I've felt in particular that I personally have needed it. Art gives us spiritual fuel and really helps us recharge and rejuvenate. And I'm winding down a 6-month fellowship with Foundation for Economic Education, which has had me put a lot of focus on politics and current events, not things that I tend to put a lot of focus on otherwise. And also, it's just been a very busy, eventful year, all good things, but I've definitely felt the need to recharge and rejuvenate. And so as I often do, really toward the holiday season, I've tried to immerse myself in more art and sort of reward myself for all the hard work that I've been doing. And dovetailing with all of this is a project that I gave myself to answer a question that I hear pretty often, which is, which Ayn Rand novel should I read first? I talk to a lot of people that have this question, and I do my best to answer it. And finally, I decided to put my thoughts down on paper, and that gave me an excuse to delve back into Rand's novels, which I like to do often, and to think about Rand's approach to art. Now, I'm not going to talk about that subject in particular on today's show. I probably will in a future episode, maybe next episode, in fact. But today I wanted to discuss some things that sort of came as realizations, or at least became more explicit in my mind while going through this process of writing this piece, and at the same time experiencing different forms of art, including a few concerts that I've gotten to see recently. And the basic idea is that if we think more like artists, we can make better decisions about how to spend our time. And this idea really crystallized in my mind while I was rereading Ayn Rand's essay, The Goal of My Writing, which is in the Romantic Manifesto. There are many profound insights in that essay, and I encourage everyone to go read it or reread it. But a few of the lines that really stuck out to me are these. She wrote, "I see the novelist as a combination of prospector and jeweler. The novelist must discover the potential, the gold mine of man's soul, must extract the gold and then fashion as magnificent a crown as his ability and vision permit." She also writes, "It is the selectivity in regard to subject, the most severely, rigorously, ruthlessly exercised selectivity, that I hold as the primary, the essential, the cardinal aspect of art." Okay, and one more quote. "That which is not worth contemplating in life is not worth recreating in art. Misery, disease, disaster, evil, all the negatives of human existence are proper subjects of study in life for the purpose of understanding and correcting them, but are not proper subjects of contemplation for contemplation's sake. In art and in literature, these negatives are worth recreating only in relation to some positive, as a foil, as a contrast, as a means of stressing the positive, but not as an end in themselves. So Rand is saying that an artist is an artist by virtue of the fact that he is selective, and he thinks really hard about the question, what is worthy of attention? What is worthy of contemplation? His job is to decide what is worthy of contemplation and then select and use the appropriate means for presenting whatever that subject is. So the artist's job is to assess the spiritual value of things, spiritual value pertaining to consciousness. Talked a lot about spiritual value in a previous episode of this podcast. So how often do we step back in our lives and, thinking like an artist, ask ourselves, what is worthy of contemplation? To contemplate means to think deeply and carefully about something. And of course, once we pose the question that way, we can see that many of the things that we do, not only do we not think carefully and deeply about them, but they don't even warrant careful and deep thought. Now, there's so much that we could say about this subject, but I want to focus on its implications for work. So I think this is really valuable. So if you enjoy contemplating some particular life-serving value as an end in itself, then it's far likelier that work requiring knowledge of that thing as a means to some other end will be very pleasant. And I gave an example of what I mean by this just a minute ago. I told you guys that I just finished writing a piece on which Ayn Rand novel to read first, which, of course, allowed me to dive back into Rand's novels, really tease out some of the best passages and think carefully and deeply about the thoughts and what's essential to each of these novels and what sorts of people they'll appeal to, what place in your life you might be where you'll find one to be of a higher value than another. So that for me, Rand's novels for me, that's a subject that is worthy of contemplation in itself. And I got to use that value in itself as a means to the end of another value. And there are all sorts of ways that one can do this in life. And actually doing some introspection, I realized that I've been doing this for years and I've just never really explicitly identified it. So just more recently in the last few years, of course, this works very well if you're a freelance writer like me, but some of the subjects that I've found to be worthy of contemplation were one of my favorite inventors in the music industry, Leo Fender, another great inventor and just brilliant mind, statesman, father of the science of electricity, really, Benjamin Franklin. And there are loads of others, Thomas Jefferson, Rosa Parks, John Locke, William Wilberforce, the heroes of the Boston Tea Party. Lots of subjects worthy of contemplation that I've used as means to the end of creating other values, that is, writing articles, and I've found that work to be really pleasant. But I was also applying this principle, though not consciously, long before working as a writer. So let's see. Growing up, one of my favorite things to do was to listen to music, and I ended up going to school for audio engineering so that I could get a job in a recording studio. I worked in a recording studio in New York City for a bit, then moved to Nashville, and I was getting paid to, among other things, listen very, very carefully to music and to help with all things involved in the recording process. Now, of course, to do my job and to do it well, I had to do many things that were not listening to music, but listening to music was one of the means to the end of my work, and that helped immensely with removing friction from my work life. For a time, like many people, I also had something of a man crush on Steve Jobs, maybe still do to some extent. And so contemplating Jobs was an end in and of itself. Jobs, the things that made him so successful, the things that make him something of a business hero. And I read his Walter Isaacson biography, really enjoyed that experience, and eventually got a job working at Apple. And so that end in itself of contemplating jobs and what made him so great became instrumental, became one of many other means to the end of the work that I did there. And I think that was really important to my work there. Likewise, another end in itself for me is my dogs. And for a time, I got to integrate that end in itself with a job, which was working at an international pet products company. So over and over again, I've found ways to take things that I find to be ends in themselves and to do work wherein that end in itself is a means to the end of the work. And this I just find really instrumental in making work more pleasant. So, not claiming that this is any earth-shattering discovery on my part, it's not. I think many of us do this already without really thinking about it. We gravitate toward work involving something that we think is worthy of contemplation. But I do think that putting words to what's going on here and being really explicit about identifying what we think is worthy of contemplation will not only enable us to pursue more work that we really enjoy, but also even within the work itself will help us to hone in on those things that we greatly value. So, for instance, as a writer, I pretty much always have a choice about what I want to write about, and I could spend all of my time writing about the current hot-button political issue of the moment. But if I ask myself, what is worthy of contemplation? Now, sometimes these current events are worthy of deep contemplation, but there are many ways to attack any given issue, and if what you're thinking about is something like, how do I make the biggest splash with this piece, and not what is worthy of contemplation, then you're less likely to go to whatever the fundamental issue is there, the thing that's at stake, the value that's at stake. And this applies even if less obviously in pretty much any work, because there's almost always somewhere to grow within a company. So to go back to when I was working at Apple, the thing that I thought was worthy of contemplation was business owners being able to do their best work. It's tied in with what drew me to Steve Jobs. And so at Apple, I was actually able to tie in this interest, this motivation, this end in itself with the work that I was doing there by joining the Apple Store business team and interfacing directly with business clients, putting together presentations about how to use Apple products in a business and how to do that effectively and efficiently. So I focused on mobile device management, wherein you can, as a company owner who owns devices that you deploy to your employees, you can manage dozens, hundreds, thousands of devices from a single computer. So you want to deploy an app to 1,000 different iPads, no problem, you can do that. So in our choice of work and in performing the work itself, I think it really pays to think more like an artist, to think more selectively. Recall that quote from Rand. It is the selectivity in regard to subject, the most severely, rigorously, ruthlessly exercised selectivity that I hold as the primary, the essential, the cardinal aspect of art. And that selectivity is selectivity of what is worthy of contemplation. So what do you think is worthy of contemplation, and how can you integrate more of that into your life? How can you take this thing that you regard as an end in itself and do work wherein that end in itself is a means to the end of the work? Say that one 5 times fast. Thinking explicitly about this has been really valuable for me, and I hope it proves valuable for you as well. That's it for today. This has been Philosophy for Flourishing. If you're enjoying the show, give us a rating and subscribe. And until next time, happy flourishing.